Today we're going to talk about one of my favorite guilty pleasure topics. I really enjoy stirring shit over this topic for a couple of reasons. One, because there's a legitimate philosophical discussion to be had about what the spirit of sport is and how we arrange the rules to meet that end, while also accounting for the fact that people will inevitably try to bump up against the limits of the rules to put up an ever increasing level of performance. And that's actually how we get excellence that drives the sport forward. There's a balance there, and that discussion is really, it's really interesting. In addition to that, this is a topic that people take very, very seriously, perhaps more seriously than they should. And whenever that's the case, it's always just low-hanging fruit to come in and push people's buttons or to just outright troll people. So the topic in question is the rules regarding powerlifting. And if you've been around the internet for more than 5 minutes, you know how charged and polarized this gets, which makes it one of my favorite things to indulge in when I feel like waking up and choosing violence. So we're going to cover a specific video that's been making the rounds that illustrates perfectly the case for changing the rules. And we're also going to check in with some other examples and some other people. Zack Telander put out a really good video about this a couple of days ago, and he cited AtlasPowerShrugged. And I thought the point that was made in that video was excellent. So I wanted to go over it, give my 2 cents on it. We're also gonna check in with Jonnie Candito. We're gonna go back about a year ago. He had a really good video discussing the bench press arch and where it's a problem and what we can potentially do about it. But yeah, instead of just poking fun at silly lifters who are making a mockery out of the sport to stroke their own ego, we're actually going to address some of the more interesting points of the philosophy around sporting regulations, how you create a fair playing field, how you encourage people to push the envelope and try to strive for greater excellence, while also preserving what the sport is actually there to do in the first place. So let's start with Mr. Telander.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to talk about the arduous debate of sumo deadlifting versus conventional deadlifting. Now, this isn't really a powerlifting channel, but we like to do, strength stuff. Weightlifters like to do deadlifts every once in a while. We do a lot of clean pulls, things like that. And I know a little bit about powerlifting.
So that exists a lot in the powerlifting culture where they try to pretend as if discussion around squatting, benching, and deadlifting should only be had by people who are actively engaged in powerlifting. And the fact is that everybody and their mother squats, benches, and deadlifts. That's one of the great things about powerlifting is it is so accessible. It appeals to so many people. And that's why the sport has had to change so much to remind itself of that widespread appeal. If powerlifting was just for powerlifters, and if it was really this closed off system that only the most dedicated and initiated could participate in, it would have continued down the path of equipped lifting, and everybody would be in like Kevlar nanotech hydraulic suits, bench pressing 1,900 pounds with soft elbows and a shallow touch. But it didn't. In the last 10 or 15 years, it embraced the fact that it appeals to so many different people and that it is so easily accessible by having a return to its roots. And that's why raw lifting outperforms equipped lifting like 20-1. If powerlifting was a sport that had a ton of nuance and a really high barrier to entry, you might make the case that powerlifting as a sport belongs to powerlifters, but it's not.
And the reason I want to talk about it today is because a meme page called United Lifters posted this video. Let's pause it at the top here, and you can see the play button, but you guys get it. I mean, we're looking at about 4 inches of range of motion, if that, off the floor. It looks like a deadlift bar where his feet are literally maximally out to the side. He's definitely not a very tall guy, so I mean, this isn't even remotely an athletic or strong position.
So you can see the very edge of the plates. That is legitimately like 4 to 5 inches off the ground. The bar is firmly on the guy's patella. It's not even above the kneecap, and his toes are about 4.5 feet apart. Now, the thing is, not everybody can get into this position. In fact, I would say that very, very few people can. And that's been kind of an argument for a lot of the people that think the rules as they are now is fine and you should just defer to the rules. Those are usually like powerlifting sycophants who take their sport way too seriously. And they think whatever the sport was when they got into it is just what it should always be. And one of the main arguments that they give is that this isn't really that big of a problem because very few people can do this. And that's true. It's the same with really big bench arches. The thing is, it's the outliers that ruin the curve. It's the outliers that are going to take the top spots. And we already see it in weight classes where you have people that can really, really game the arch. you have some of the biggest presses being put up by guys who can limit the range of motion to a couple of inches. In the deadlift, you have Danny Grigsby just obliterating Benedict Magnussen's 10-15 deadlift. Benedict Magnussen weighed 380 pounds. He was one of the best deadlifters in strongman in a sea of world-class deadlifters. And his feat got trumped by like 60 pounds by somebody who weighs 100 pounds less, because they were able to implement a technique that cut the range down and thereby cut the work down. One lifter finished the lifts with their feet about shoulder width apart. They had to bend over at the waist. They had to hinge. They had to extend the hips substantially through a wide range of motion to stand up. The other one locked the bar out on their kneecaps and was essentially completely upright through the entire lift. They turned it into a standing leg press. Now, you can think that's fine, but people have eyeballs, and everybody that's going to be exposed to powerlifting is going to see these outliers perform and recognize immediately that there is a difference. And it's the same thing with equipped lifting. You can defend equipped lifting as much as you want, but when every person who gets exposed to your sport, who themselves lifts or is familiar with a barbell, when they look at it and scratch their head and say, what the hell are they doing? That's a problem. And it's something that has to be addressed if you do want the sport to continue to grow past the athlete fantasy camp that it is right now, where consumers pay a $100 entry fee to feel like an athlete for a day. If you want it to grow past that, this shit has to be addressed.
In general, I think that picking up things from the floor is like an immutable human action. This has very little relation to that immutable thing where we want to pick things up. This is more about how can I find the best way to meet the standard of picking the thing up without actually having to pick it up.
That's a really important point, and it speaks to what the spirit of the sport is. The spirit of the sport is in relation to this like very old, very primal thing. There's a tradition to it. And that's why we love things like strongman and Highland games, picking up rocks, throwing things. It demonstrates this base physical ability that's kind of what all other more complex sports are built off of. So on the one hand, the sport wants to benefit by appealing to that sense, but it also wants to cater to people who want to turn it into something else entirely.
This isn't the only place that this happens in powerlifting specifically. We can look at the bench press in powerlifting, which is absolutely ridiculous. I just saw a compilation from Jack PGM. By the way, shout out to Jack PGM. Easily one of my favorite YouTube channels. My roommate Chris Williamson and I like literally sit down and watch on the TV. We watch Jack PGM together and we die laughing. But he just made a video called Spinal, and there's a section where he just shows powerlifters and their bench press setups and minimizing the range of motion. We also have the squat in powerlifting. People are trying to game that. They throw their legs out super wide, they shoot their hips back, and they barely get to about 90 degrees and stand up, and then they call that a world record. That's usually in the geared powerlifting section.
Like even with equipped lifting, like I understand the why of equipped lifting. Sam from Elite FTS from Dave Tate's podcast was talking about it, and he said that it's closer to NASCAR than anything else because it's based around the equipment and the technology and the crew and everybody kind of putting this thing together. And I kind of get the appeal of that. Like I really do. The problem is that it was so different. It was such a big divergent from what people know lifting to be that it was killing the sport. I started lifting in 99, 2000. And at the time, every Muscle and Fitness, every magazine that had a centerfold with a competitive powerlifter had somebody in an Inzer suit with their elbows pulled in, or Scott Mendelson or Tiny Meeker benching 1,100 pounds with soft elbows. Those displays had such little appeal to the average person that it put the sport in a box, and it actually started to kill the sport. The only reason that powerlifting had a resurgence, and it had a massive resurgence, was because CrossFit exploded, introduced a whole bunch of people to a barbell, and raw lifting made it accessible to those people. So it was really easy to pivot into meets. You didn't need the technology anymore because now there were divisions that eliminated all of the excess gear, and the sport grew. Now, I guess whether or not you want that to determine the path that the sport goes to depends on what your mission is. If you do want to grow the sport, if you want it to be an Olympic sport, or if you want it to actually get to the level of like professional ball sports where you have the money being driven by spectators and advertisers, not by the athletes actually paying an entry fee. If you want it to get to that point, then yes, it absolutely matters. But if you're content with it being your own backyard circus sideshow oddity, and I know that there's people that are, I guess you can very easily make the case that nothing really needs to change.
Not me being like, I really want you guys to understand this is not me being like weightlifting is superior to powerlifting. This is not what I'm trying to say. It's more of a like, where are we going? Where is this whole thing headed? Because look, if we look at this dude right here who just did 725 and it's the fastest deadlift you've ever seen, right? Fastest 725. Here's him doing a 485 pound conventional deadlift. Okay, we're gonna have to mute this. Look at this. Look at this grind. It's actually like I've never actually seen that before. Somebody who quote unquote deadlifts 725.
That's hilarious. I don't even know how you have the strength, even in that advantage setup. Let's equate that sumo deadlift to like a 18-inch deadlift where the bar starts like right below the knee, like that limited range. I don't know how you can move 725, even in that advantage setup, and not have the basic strength to stand up with 500 pounds in a conventional stance. I mean, 500 is such a low bar. It's such a low standard to hit. So you have someone on the one hand is just world class over here, but once you kind of take away their specialization, they become very run of the mill. I mean, this shows that it's not just that it's different, it's somehow separate or evolved from the main thing that you're trying to find out, which is basic strength and physical ability. It shows that it's actually detrimental to it. It will actually limit the ability of people to build a certain amount of mass or strength because they're so focused on this hyper specialization. If this guy only could pull conventional because that's only what was allowed, he would be deadlifting way more than 500 pounds. He would be stronger and more useful for it. And I think that's important to point out because a lot of people fall in love with powerlifting like I did early on because they like the idea of being strong and capable. But once you go down that rabbit hole of over specializing, you end up on the other end in a very different spot than you thought you would be. I experienced that. My first 400 pound bench was with a very narrow grip, very high arch. It was about a 6-inch press. I didn't even look like I worked out. And I was very like disheartened because as cool as it was to say, I don't care about being big. I don't care about how I look. The fact was that it did not feel good to be at a bar and have to like convince people that you bench 400 pounds because they didn't believe you by looking at you. I also didn't possess the raw upper body strength that a 400 pound bench would suggest. And that became evidence when I tried to get that strength to carry over to other things. That is very important to differentiate between the feat and what the feat suggests you should be able to do if you're trying to get carryover from that physical ability. It's a very, very different thing. And the way this guy kind of jumps around after this lift, people on this side of things have gotten very, very comfortable with like the blind positivity that exists in powerlifting because we're expected not to pick apart performances like you do with athletes in any other sport on the planet. You're supposed to pretend as if every display of strength is exactly the same, that you shouldn't talk about leverages or equipment or strategy, that individual differences somehow have no bearing on what the person is potentially capable of.
So AtlasPowerShrugged, I've mentioned him a ton on this channel. He has been, very, very heavily referenced on this channel because I love his content. This is titled here, Powerlifting has become the exact opposite of what it was intended to be. What the current debate about sumo and bench arch tells us about strength competition in general. In basically every pursuit, there's a quite reasonable desire to find simple metrics that provide a reasonable approximation of the quality in question. If you want to quickly determine how a sports car performs relative to other cars, you don't want to have to learn every detail of its engineering and performance in every situation. You'd rather quickly look up one metric, like the time it takes to go from 0 to 60 miles per hour, or 100 kilometers per hour, right around there. In theory, this should work fairly well as this stat represents traction and power to weight ratio, very important characteristics for performance. The problem is there's a number of ways to improve 0 to 60 time that don't do anything to improve overall performance. Do you see where this is going, guys? For example, launch control, or even hurt overall performance, certain gear ratios, tire choice, etc. And when 0 to 60 became the number one metric, that's exactly what car manufacturers started doing, meaning that 0 to 60 times are now a less useful metric for overall performance than they used to be. In the same way, how much you bench was a much better shorthand metric for general upper body strength before lifters realized that they could gain competitive advantage by turning the bench press into a spinal mobility competition.
I thought this analogy that AtlasPowerShrugged used was absolutely brilliant. I thought it was really good. It's a really one-to-one analogy. You have this metric that people use to tell you all of these other things, and that's widely accepted. And then people get lost trying to game this one particular metric, and they end up doing a whole bunch of shit that has nothing to do with what the initial metric was supposed to be. There's a reason bench pressing is used in football combines. I mean, of all the lifts, it's the shittiest one for performance. But there's this idea that somebody who can bench 225 for a lot of reps is going to be strong. And that says something about their general physical ability, which is important to a scout. If you had somebody in a combine benching to these parameters, it would tell you absolutely nothing. It wouldn't be used because it wouldn't be a worthwhile metric. And you have to concede at some point that that is actually an integral part of the sport. So I thought this was a really, really good point made by AtlasPowerShrugged.
It's fun to see who can pick up the most weight. It's fun to see who can beat the shit out of the other guy. Who's the toughest guy in here? It's not really that fun to see someone dance around and hope to win on points in a fight. It's not really fun to watch someone with their feet all the way out to the sides deadlift the bar 2.5 inches and scream at the top of their lungs like they did something.
So that's a great point. And one of the things I routinely go to when I'm criticizing or evaluating these types of performances is, what is this person physically capable of doing? What can we predict about them given what we know about them? You would think somebody who can deadlift 725 for a triple would have an insanely strong upper back, midsection, posterior, that their hip extension would be strong, that they would be capable of a lot of things that somebody who doesn't possess that strength would be able to. And when you have a very advantaged sumo puller putting up big numbers, I, as a strongman, as somebody who comes from that background where I have to be able to predict what my pulling ability or my opponent's pulling ability is going to mean for our ability to pick up farmer walk handles or stones or run with yokes or move sandbags, to do all of these like real functional displays of physical ability. Coming from that background, I know for a fact that somebody like this wouldn't place in the top 50% at amateur nationals. And for whatever group of people think that isn't relevant, I think you've gotten so immersed in this field, in this one particular niche within a niche, that you've lost sight of what sport actually is and what this is supposed to be doing. And I think those people, those are the people that are happy going to these small punk rock shows that don't want their favorite band to go mainstream. These are the people that want to limit engagement. They want it to stay this tight, specific little thing because they're infatuated with how it was when they found it. But the idea that a sport like would not evolve to address issues like this is absolutely silly. The whole like, it's the rules, so don't question it. That's just an absurd take. Like, the problem is with the rules. Now, I dug up an old video from Jonnie Candito that talked about the same subject. It was in regards to arching and the bench press. And he made some really good points along the same lines as far as like philosophically, how should we approach this? What things do we need to weigh when trying to figure out where to go next?
So depending on the bench press competition rules, at the first, your hip has to attach to the seat and your elbow has to be straight. My bar has already attached to my chest, so I call this no range bench press, also zero bench.
So this is the ultimate conclusion if you don't come up with a way to limit this type of stuff. You have to curb or disincentivize this type of thing, or else you're going to get people with literally zero range movements. This person found a way to arch into the bench press where their elbows are locked out. That's a good lockout. It also requires zero range of motion. Similarly with a deadlift, I can imagine a person with a build, with a setup where their deadlift actually doesn't have range of motion. Similarly with the deadlift, there are people I've asked, how do you do block pulls with that setup? And their answer is, I can't, because the block pull starts at lockout.
I believe the bench press rules in powerlifting should be changed. And I disagree with a lot of USAPL and IPF lifters, people on Reddit forums. A lot of times the way this argument goes is someone posts an extreme arch bencher, like Sean Noriega, who we'll have on this video. Then people trash talk him, which is very stupid. That's caveman behavior. But then people will then come back to that and say, well, it's just arbitrary rules. You know, so not only is it not the lifter's fault, which is true, but also nothing needs to change. It's like a basketball player being tall. Most of the lifters who say rules are rules and, you know, it just is what it is, and it's the public's fault for not understanding it, are the same people who advocate for raw powerlifting. That's the reason why most of us are in this sport now. So if rules are rules, well then we would have just kept equipped lifting and there would have been no reason to change to make the lifting more relatable.
That's a great point. That goes back to what I said earlier. Like, if it was just the rules are the rules and powerlifting exists for itself and to satisfy its own little fanatical base, if that was the case, then nothing would have changed and the sport would have continued to niche itself into obscurity by being completely removed from anything that the average spectator might be able to relate to or understand.
And ultimately, a higher transfer to other sports because it is more strength related. That matters. And let's get more on that last point. Powerlifting is the ultimate test of strength. The 3 lifts are disciplines that test human strength, and it is the best competition to measure this. This is straight from the IPF's About page. So they explicitly say they are for testing strength. Those who say it is an arbitrary sport are wrong. In fact, I've actually been working on this video for so long that the About page used to be longer, and it even mentioned lifts commonly done in gyms worldwide and transfer to other sports. So the IPF explicitly sold the sport on transfer to other sports. I mean, think about that.
So even like the gold standard of the sport, what many people see, like the IPF, they're supposed to be like the representative. They're the ones trying to get into the Olympics. They're the ones having the doping standards and the really strict technical rules. Even they understand that the existence of their sport is based upon, their success is based upon the relationship that weightlifting fundamentally has to society at large. Strongman, it's the exact same thing. There is this connection to tradition. There's this connection to other sports, to athleticism. There's this interest that general people have with what does your expertise in this say about that? It is completely lazy and unreasonable to think that these things exist in their own little universe and they should never be touched, disturbed, or influenced by anything else. It is their connection to everything else that actually makes them interesting and worth paying attention to.
The two ways to go about this is either the IPF should stop marketing the sport this way, they should cut all of that strength talk out if they're not going to adjust anything to that, or they should adjust to make sure that each lift is demonstrating strength. To bring it back to that argument about, hey, this is similar to taller basketball players, sure. What do you think the NBA did when Wilt Chamberlain laid it up from the free throw line? They created a rule so that you cannot cross the free throw line. That happens all the times in sports when parity and entertainment value are both decreased. If it's both a big enough issue and prevalent enough, then yes, all sports adjust to the demands of the public. To not do so would be extremely irrational. Let's get straight to the solution. Narrowing grip width by weight class. Have the 74 kilogram weight class and below grip with their pinkies inside the rings. Have the 83 to 93 kilogram class grip with their ring fingers inside the rings or narrower. And then the big boys beyond that can grip normally with the index finger on the rings. I believe this is the best solution initially because it's gradual, it's addressing something that's prevalent as well. For example, I looked in the 2017 top 20 world rankings in the bench press, 15 out of 20 gripped with their index finger on the rings. In fact, the 74 kilogram class, so 163 pound men, actually gripped wider than any other weight class, not even taking into account relative to frame. To me, it is very irrational that a 93 pound girl would have the same grip width restrictions that a 400 pound man would.
The discussion around bench width is really interesting because it's completely arbitrary that you can regulate grip width on a bench, but not foot width on a squat or deadlift. It makes no sense whatsoever. There is a reason that they limit how wide you can grip a bench, and it is because if a lifter can grip as wide as they want, you are more likely to have these like no range touch benches where no actual feed is demonstrated. Similarly with a deadlift and a squat, the wider you go, the more range is limited, the more compact, shallow the movement is, and it becomes something different than what was initially being contested. Now, I don't know how I feel about having different grips per weight class. I mean, it's relative to frame. So, I mean, do you want to go all the way to where you're measuring individual lifters' physical dimensions and coming up with a formula for where they can grip? That seems excessive. Weight class, it makes a bit more sense. However, there are a lot of different frames that exist within the same weight class. It tends to be that lighter guys are shorter, but you'll still see a spread. You'll see a guy that's 5'10" in the super heavies. You might see a guy that's 6 foot weighing under 90 kilos. So I don't think that there is a simple solution, but that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be any regulation or any attempt to solve the problem.
Now, a lot of you may be saying, but Johnny, what about sumo? Shouldn't we outlaw the sumo if everything that's efficient isn't really demonstrating strength and all
Yes, you should.
that? With more evidence, I would be open to it. However, I don't think the evidence currently supports it. In studies where they compare EMG activation, the lumbar rectors, hamstrings, and glutes are pretty much the same as far as sumo versus conventional, and the only major difference is in the quad.
Johnny. You were on a roll, man. You were doing so good. Using an EMG study to try and talk about the relative difficulty of two different lifts, I just find to be incredibly silly. We have the data that tells you the potential improvement in performance over a population of lifters with one versus the other. We have that. You don't need to try to derive it from shoddy EMG data. You just need to look at which calibers of lifters are lifting which weights in which style. We already have Benedict Magnussen's 10:15 record, which stood for like a decade, and it got obliterated by Danny Grigsby, who weighs like 100 pounds less than he did. Benedict Magnussen weighed 380. He was an immensely talented deadlifter among a sea of the world's best deadlifters. He would go to the Deadlift World Championships and do well. He would go to some of the biggest strongman events and do well against the best deadlifters. He pulled 10:15, stood for a decade. Danny Grigsby pulled like a 10:70 something sumo. And it's because he gamed the metric. He had a build that allowed him to exploit a setup that cut the range in half. I don't know how you can point to EMG studies when we already have the top deadlifters of all time being guys in the 220s. I don't know how you can point to EMG studies when we already have the list of the best deadlifters of all time being guys in the 275s, the 242s, and even the 220s having 950 plus deadlifts. They're all sumo pullers. When you're seeing guys who weigh 100 pounds less outpulling the best heavyweights of all time, how can you come to the conclusion that there isn't an inherent advantage there? You simply can't. So yeah, it's an interesting topic. There is no clear-cut solution to it. Any solution you try to implement is going to have some trade-off. It's going to displace somebody. It means no matter what you do, there are going to be powerlifters who are protesting on the internet how they don't like such and such a rule because of X, Y, and Z. Most rational lifters aren't going to make the case that nothing needs to change. Those people exist, but they're the fanatics. They're the people that don't care about the sport being anything other than this thing that they've used to glob onto as an identity. If you're actually interested in sport for the sake of sport, if you're actually interested in the growth of this sport beyond a niche that just appeals to a small group of fanatics, then you have to acknowledge that something has to change to keep the sport growing, or else it's just not going to be taken seriously. So that's all I got for today, guys. Thanks so much for stopping by. Don't forget to check out Patreon if you want to see my training. I upload it daily. Everything gets filmed, edited, there's commentary. So you get to see day to day exactly how I train. Also check out the Base Strength page on Facebook. It is absolutely free. And if you haven't, go ahead and check out my books, Base Strength, Peak Strength, Superior Deadlift. They're all available on my store, EmpireBarbellStore.com or Amazon. Thanks so much for watching. Until next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.